Hello and welcome. Today is Friday, August the 15th, 2014. This is Paul Sandhu coming to you with another episode of Wake Up and Live Radio. And it is my pleasure to have back on one of our most popular guests, Mr. Jim Willie, editor of the Hat Trick Letter, found on his website, goldenjackass.com. So without further ado, hello and welcome, Jim.
Oh, it's good to be back, Paul. So much is happening. It's really an acceleration of events, but it's not an acceleration toward anything that I would call progress. It's an acceleration of degraded systems, and it's kind of sad what's going on. We don't have forces of good that are in charge, not anymore, not for a long time. So it's very unfortunate to see the developments, and we're going to focus on Ukraine and sanctions. They're a very big story today.
So what you're saying is that things are deteriorating out there, they're degenerating, they're not getting better, and one of the important regions of the world to focus on is Ukraine. So let's begin there. What's going on there? And since this regime or the government in Ukraine was changed, who is the new regime in Kiev now?
Well, first of all, the names are very difficult to keep straight in your head. They're Slavic names. They kind of blur in the memory. But let's just say that the former ousted Kiev president was giving up on the European Union and was making very firm gestures toward the Russian customs union, as they call it. Russia is trying to build up a few countries and actually have a new currency that would be gold-backed, and it could get some momentum. But I'm talking about nations centered on, for instance, Kazakhstan. I mean, most Americans don't even know where Kazakhstan is, but it's one of the former Soviet republics. So as this former ousted Kiev leader was basically pushing away the Europeans toward the European Union, he didn't see the big advantages, didn't see the big future. He was working to embrace Russia and Eastern alliance elements. So the U.S. came in and executed a coup d'etat using Langley mercenaries and using Soros mercenaries, using Blackwater, whatever they call themselves. They're changing their name every 3 months so you don't know who they are. But it's Blackwater, and I've been corrected. I call them Blackstone once in a while, but it's easy to remember. Blackwater is sewer water. Sewer water is working through the veins politically with Blackwater involvement as mercenaries, and it's the same crew that was involved in Iraq doing, shooting exercises from helicopters of civilians with targets and bets, and no prosecution. These people, the mercenaries, have no laws applying to them. So the Langley mercenaries and the Soros mercenaries have been working eagerly and organizing the military, which I'm hearing is disintegrating in Ukraine. They're out of supplies. Here's the funny thing, Paul. I've got a client, a Hat Trick Letter client, who lives in the suburbs of Kiev, and he has a Gmail account. Okay, that's fine. I've also got another American-based, U.S.-based client, Hat Trick Letter client, whose wife is from Kiev and makes frequent phone calls. So I get some information, and I've also got another fellow named Jaroslav who lives in St. Petersburg, Russia, which is a long way away, but he's got a lot of contacts. And I've also got a Hungarian contact who's a Hat Trick Letter subscriber, and he has direct contact. So I'm getting quite a lot of information. What I'm hearing is that the Ukraine army, the military, is being surrounded all over the place. They're running out of supplies, they're running out of water, they're running out of food, and they're doing mass desertions, and the Russian army is taking them without beating them up. They're just taking them and saying, come without your weapons, and we'll give you a meal. We understand the situation you're in. A very important point that Americans need to understand is that this is a Langley war. This is not a U.S. military war. This is being funded by narcotics in Langley. This is a narco mercenary war. They also need to understand that the posts being filled in the Kiev regime, the new guy who's also has a name ending in itch and his first letter is a Y. I can't keep them straight. Whatever. The new guy is a fascist. And they don't hide their swastikas on their armbands. They're proud of it. This is the far right coming of age in Ukraine. But people need to understand, not only is this a Langley and mercenary war funded by narcotics, but the key ministry posts for the Kiev regime and their central bank head all come, almost all. I'm hearing like it's a dozen. It's amazing. This is a takeover. They almost all come from a little country in the southeast corner of the Mediterranean, an ally to the United States, from their security agency that starts with an M and whose name I don't like to mention. So we've got a massive fascist organization with operations and raids. And gosh, it wasn't 3 weeks after the coup d'etat done by Langley and Soros, not the Russians. People need to wake up. This is not a Russian operation. It's a Langley and Soros operation. It wasn't 2 weeks before they stole 33 tons of gold at the central bank in Kiev. And who's the central bank head? A little nitwit coming from the little southeast Mediterranean nation from their security agency that starts with the letter M. So this is a raid and theft. And I honestly believe, it didn't take me long to conclude this, but I think the United States wants to basically destroy eastern Ukraine. And that's where the Russians are. The western Ukraine is where the Slavic-speaking, the Ukrainian-speaking people are. That's where the farm fields are, tremendous farm fields. And my sources tell me that no more than 80% of the fields were planted. I thought that it was very little, and I got it wrong. And I have no reluctance to say I got it wrong. Here's the data that I am given from 2 different sources in Ukraine. They've got no more than 80% of the fields planted, but the problem is going to come with the harvest in the next couple of months. Where will the trucks be? Where will the diesel fuel be? Where will the men be? Where will the markets be? My guess is that we're going to see chaos, so that even though they've got some planted fields, 80% at most, they're going to have a lot of shortages because they're going to have trouble getting it to market for processing. The Kiev regime is turning everything in the country and the economy into a war machine. They're dismantling the eastern Ukrainian mills, factories, and resetting them in the West. I don't mean Western Europe, I mean Western Ukraine. This is insane what's going on. I believe the U.S. is trying to create a scorched earth to just wreck the East, and they don't care about life. You've got entire towns now in eastern Ukraine that are without water and electricity. These people don't care. This is kind of an extension of the ethnic cleansing that we saw in Yugoslavia with Bosnia, Herzegovina, and a lot of, that was Christian versus Muslim, but all white. This is Russian speaking versus Ukrainian speaking. And they're all Eastern Orthodox Catholic. So it's not exactly ethnic cleansing based on religion. It's ethnic cleansing based on background, the Russian background. And another thing, Americans need to get their facts straight. Russia did not march in and take control of Crimea. They went quickly to their naval base in Crimea, their only warm water port in the world, the Black Sea, and they conducted immediately a referendum for whether the citizens of Crimea wanted to become part of Russia, and 93 to 95% said yes, and none of this is in the stinking propaganda-ridden U.S. Western press. I've noticed something else that's kind of interesting. It's coming out just in the last few days. It's Putin criticizing the European Union commissioners and the nations themselves, calling them insolvent nations trying to push their weight around even though they're broken. Okay, Putin understands these are insolvent nations. But I think the U.S., their basic motive is to stop the Russian capture of Europe and turning it into a dedicated client for energy supply. They don't want the monopoly of Gazprom with all the pipelines going through Ukraine. They don't want Europe to become a dedicated client to the Russian energy business. So this is just an unbelievable piece of chaos.
Yes, out of chaos, of course, comes order. So I'm sure that there is a post-chaos scenario that has already been, war-gamed, planned, and will probably be implemented sometime in the future. So we will see how that will shape up to be. By the way,
I'm not so sure that anything constructive along what you're referring to. I think the war games involve first-strike nuclear hits. So
Jim, we gotta remember one thing. Okay, sorry to interrupt you, but historically speaking, these megalomaniacs, these Caesars, these Neros, they have no problem destroying everything in their path. So you know what? So I'm not saying that something, the order that'll come will necessarily be what we have today with, law and order and, commerce and economies and nation building and all that. It could be just that everything gets scorched and out of that, that may be just what they desire. Who knows?
I don't think Western Europe is going to be subjected to war. I think it's going to be more of the same, financial and economic warfare. And that's what we're seeing now with the sanctions, which is a really good topic to get into. There's so much going on with these sanctions.
Absolutely. These sanctions really make no sense to me, especially how they are selectively enforced, or maybe they're not even being enforced, but they are, I think they're excluding the energy sector of Russia from these sanctions, aren't they?
It seems pretty clear. To me, it looks like two things are at work. The Rockefellers are saying, hey, look, we've got ExxonMobil, and we're doing projects right now in the Arctic. We got some offshore projects in the Black Sea with Russia and Rosneft. Don't mess with us. We're bigger than your Obama administration. We Rockefellers, we rule the roost. The other thing is they don't want to really piss off the Kremlin to the point that they say, all right, we're just going to cut off, say, 30% of your gas supply and see how you like it. And maybe why don't you knock on your European commissioners' doors, these guys who were never elected, who are waging the war. And why don't you ask them, how do we get back the 30% of the natural gas flow that the Kremlin just cut off? They don't want that kind of reaction. So they're doing kind of mealy-mouth sanctions. And what you're seeing by the West is a gradual ratcheting of sanctions. It's like they're testing the Russian bear to see how bad the bear will claw back. Bears typically can rip your entire throat out. They're targeting Russian banks. They're targeting Russian oligarchs. It seems like a half-hearted exercise. But this thing started over a year ago, March of 13, in Cyprus. This is where the battle started between the West and Russia. We were told about, all these bail-ins and insolvent Cyprus banks, and they got big deficits, and they wanted eagerly to be part of the European Union, and it didn't work out. No, that wasn't the real story. The real story was that Russia was using Gazprom Bank and VTB as giant banks for processing treasury bonds in Cyprus, converting them to gold. Okay, so that's where the first bank action by the US and the Europeans took place, shutting down the conversion facilities, the Russian banks in Cyprus. Okay, but we get, this whole, anytime you look at Ukraine and their political setup, I'm not talking about their parliament. I'm talking about their billionaires, their oligarchs. It's an overused word, but it's really important because they've got 6 or 8 oligarchs there that control, say, the farms, that control a couple of banks, that control some of the pipelines. They got a lot of oligarchs, and they're good oligarchs and bad oligarchs. They're pro-Russian oligarchs, and they're fascist, anti-Russian oligarchs. And I just like to point out a weird fact. Ukraine has never been a real creditable, honorable nation regarding its banks. Its economy is kind of a joke. They've got the agrarian economy, and to be sure, a lot of really good farmers and good people working in the factories there. But they've also got a lot of white women trafficking. They've got a lot of banking having to do with sale of white women. They've got a lot of banking having to do with Nigerian fraud all over the world. They do their banking in Ukraine. Ukraine's never been honorable. It's kind of a joke of a country, but it's a huge transit line, transit location for something like 40% or more, 50% of all the natural gas from Russia to Europe goes through Ukraine. Now, it's real important to understand what's going on with the pipelines and the various networks. About 10 years ago, Russia decided we need an alternative. We need to go through the north. We need to supply Germany directly. We don't want to deal with going through Poland and Hungary. So they went straight to the North Sea. And it's underwater, and it's LNG facilities. I think there are at least 2 German LNG facilities coming from Gazprom. So Germany's got some supply that's not through Ukraine, from Russia. That is in operation and has been in operation for a few years. It's called Nord Stream. Okay, Nord Stream is operational. Russia and the Kremlin and Gazprom were not content with that because let's get plain. Ukraine and its oligarchs have been siphoning and stealing Russian gas going through their pipelines for decades. Not a couple of years, for decades. The Russians are sick of it. They can't stop it because the tubes, the pipes, they're enormous. They're like 12 feet diameter. And the Ukrainians have underground storage facilities to hide their stolen gas. So when I thought that maybe we'd have about 2 or 3 months where Ukraine would run out of gas, I was wrong. They've got 4 and 5 months of stolen gas underground facilities for storage. This is an amazing story. But, I don't think these sanctions are going to harm Russia much. They're going to harm Europe a lot. They've got the handoff policy regarding Gazprom. They don't want to back Gazprom into the corner. And notice that there's been a lawsuit case brought to the European Commission. They call them the glass and steel offices of Brussels. But Gazprom was in a case against Lithuania for price fixing. And, it's probably a frivolous case. And Lithuania doesn't like the fact that they've got 100% dependence on Russia for their gas. The big victims coming up are going to be the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia. Oh, gosh, what's the other one? Latvia. These three countries are going to get, I think, knocked flat by sanctions. They're just too close to Russia, and they're just, what I'm reading is that their economy is going to decline like 50%. But you've got this recent lawsuit case where the monopoly pricing, what Gazprom tried to do is to say, hey, look, you got this weird pricing of natural gas. It's different in every single continent. It's not like a world price for natural gas. We're going to link it to the oil price. But the oil price went up. So the gas price went up for Lithuania, and they didn't like it because they're 100% dependent. So they had a lawsuit case. And the important thing that I'm bringing up here is that it looks like the lawsuit case is going to die on the vine. It's just not going anywhere. There's a fellow named Aluminia. I can't. Maybe I'm getting the name pronounced wrong. It's one of the commissioners or one of the big mucky mucks in the EU Commission. And he's about to retire. And it's his case. It's his baby. And he's just not taking it forward. So it might just go away. I think that's very important. But the other important thing to notice about these sanctions is that Exxon, Boeing, certain French military contractors, Dutch, Shell, they don't, pardon me, they don't seem to be subjected to the rules of these sanctions. So if you're a big enough company, you're not subject to the rules of the U.S. government sanctions. Now, I'd like to point out something. It's incredibly important. The essence of the fascist business model is that it joins the state with big corporations where their illegal, corrupt practices are sponsored, protected, and flourish to the detriment of the nation. And we're seeing that with the United States, with weapons contractors and big banks and pharmaceutical companies and whatever. But notice that Exxon and Dutch Shell and Boeing, energy companies and weapons suppliers, are not subjected to the sanctions against Russia. These are major corporations that are saying F you to the Obama administration. Normally, what you get is the biggest corporations drive the process. Here, the fascist business model looks like it's coming undone. And I think it's a major, major point that's not being discussed out there.
Yes, now, those are very, very good points, Jim. As far as these sanctions are concerned, obviously the sanctions against Russia, they are toothless. But what Russia has done in return, in placing their own sanctions on a lot of agricultural products out of the U.S., Canada, EU, the European Union, Australia, etc., is that something that has some real bite to it?
It has enough bite to it where you're going to see an increasing amount of fracturing of the support for the European Union, the entire Union.
So do you think that's a good move by Putin, then? He's a good chess player.
I do. And, a lot of people say, oh, gosh, you're just a Putin lover. No, I admire the guy. He's a tremendous adversary who's combating the incredible corruption that's going on behind the dollar regime and the Wall Street banks and their war machine on a credit card. And now it's a war machine on a narco profit line. No, I'm amazed sometimes. I'll be honest with you. I like to watch some of the Steven Seagal movies, and they're bad B movies. Don't get me wrong. They're bad movies. But notice how Seagal takes an assailant, a guy coming at him. He takes the momentum of the guy coming at him, and he just, grabs his arms or grabs his shirt and flips it around and uses that man's momentum to flip him on his back and to cause injury. He uses the momentum of the attacker to waylay the attacker. He doesn't start out and say, I'm going to use my energy and hurt you. He uses the assailant's energy and flips him. That's what Putin has done. It's a brilliant stroke, especially when you bring into play the fact that the Kremlin has already lined up South American agricultural producers to fill the void. We're talking about Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, and Chile. They've already made contracts with Russia to fill the void. So you're going to
they must be laughing all the way to the bank.
Well, it's going to be some big disruptions, Dash. To be sure, this is not going to be smooth. You don't say, hey, look, we were getting 50 tons a week of peaches and pears and apples, and now we're going to get it from Brazil. No problem. No, the logistics are a nightmare.
No, I understand that, and I saw this news clip out of Spain where the farmers are just up in arms because it is really hurting them. So basically, these sanctions, rather than hurting, I mean, like you said, these sanctions are real bite, and it is hitting home, very close to home in Europe for sure.
Oh, I think we're going to see some tremendous problems in Spain, France, Italy, and Portugal. Those nations are the breadbasket. Those are the producers. I think Spain produces the majority of fruit for all of Europe, and their surplus goes to Russia. You're going to see a good deal of Southern European production from the farms, not just grains, not just fruit, but meats, pork, beef. It's just going to die on the vine. It's going to rot on the vine and rot in the warehouse. And you're going to see a number of agricultural firms go bankrupt. Watch China come in and buy them up. I mean, this is going to be a disaster. So notice that Putin has said that this is at most a 1-year agricultural sanction. It could be 6 months. What does Putin want? He's been very clear. We don't want war. We want negotiations over Ukraine and open discussions that Russia is not behind the coup that changed the Kiev regime. The United States doesn't want conversation. They just want to come up with other propaganda BS, make claims, and not substantiate anything, and go to war. I mean,
well, that's like the news we cover with Putin, making him out to be looking like a Nazi, black shirt or something. Did you see that?
No, I didn't, because I really don't care. What I find to be the case is that those in control of the press use their own characteristics and label the enemy as having those characteristics. Where is the perception that Bush, Clinton, Obama are fascists? No, they're neoliberals and neocons. No, they're fascists, Marxists. It's amazing what's going on regarding perceptions of American politics right now. Neocon, which is Condoleezza Rice and Brzezinski and Kissinger and Bush, they're Nazis. They're fascists. Neocon means fascists. The Patriot Act was the fascist manifesto. It eradicated the rights and liberties and basically tore up the Constitution. I'm amazed that the Supreme Court even cites the Constitution. I'd like to see the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon reinstate the Constitution and push out these neocon fascist Nazis. So, they could paint Putin any way they want, but Putin is installing capitalism in Russia, and it's to be sure it's got its bumps in the road. I have a comment that I brought up a couple of times, maybe more, in the last year or so with The Voice, because he's got some contacts in Central Europe and contacts in China, contacts in Hong Kong, even contacts in Kremlin. And I said to him, if Russia intends to become a major player, they're going to have to improve upon their contract law. They can't just go in there and seize some oligarch's property, change title, and just do whatever they want willy-nilly to suit their needs. They're going to have to honor the contracts. Like there was a case of Pan Am Silver, lost their entire Russian location for a silver mine. Okay, well, you can't do that. And the comment from The Voice really surprised me. He said, the Kremlin has hired Germans to bring up to speed their contract law. And this
it may not just be Germans, Rick. I mean, Jim, as you know, I'm in the restaurant business, and I once met a Canadian lawyer, and what he was doing was that's exactly what he was doing. He was writing laws for the Russians. And I'm sure it has something to do with these type of contract laws. So they're using Americans and Canadians and, like you said, the Germans. So, yes, absolutely, I agree with you 100%. That's just validation of what you're saying.
But let's take this to the next step. Who's going to sit on the bench as judge in the hundreds of courts in Russia? You going to have Germans?
No, of course you're not going to, but you see, it is like it'll take a generation for the new generation to come up. Like in India, once the British left, they wrote them a constitution, so which was based on the British system. So it took a while before all the judges and the lawyers and everybody got trained in that system. So I would expect it's going to take about a generation. Then it'll be the next generation that'll be able to understand and implement those things. I don't think it'll happen overnight.
I tend to agree with you, but I also think that it'd be more like a decade, 10 years, where Putin and the Kremlin just tell the judges, you can't play those games anymore. You got to honor the law, and we've just given you a better code of law, and you got to work with the law. So they've got to clean up their oligarchs. They've got some, multi-billionaires running around, and some of them are getting killed. You had a guy killed a little over a year ago in London, 2 years ago, I think, in London. And I was told he was a really nasty guy. So Russia's got to clean up their act regarding contract law, regarding judicial system. But, oh boy, this is not easy. There's a very big transition going on, and I'm clear as day that the United States is using Ukraine to try to interrupt the Russians from capturing Europe and extending the Eurasian Union, the Eurasian trade zone, to include most of Europe. They need to just cut that off and do it with a firewall. The firewall is Ukraine. They don't care if they kill 5 million people in eastern Ukraine. They don't care. The fascists have never had a high regard for life, human life. Never. There's no example. None. Ever. So look at what's happening even with the convoy. I hear there's a convoy something like 4 or 5 miles long of relief, food and water and supplies for eastern Ukraine cities done by the United Nations with the help of the Kremlin supplying them. And the Kiev regime is blocking them. They're saying, they're giving flimsy reasons like, oh, you got a lot of weapons in there hidden in the trucks. Well, check the trucks then. Let the food go through. Stop the weapons. I don't think there is much in the way of weapons. These are people, the fascists have no regard for human life, and they're on record. They want to exterminate the Russians in the east of their country. This is what we're dealing with here, but I think, beyond the human element, there's a commercial angle where the Americans want to interrupt the encroachment of Russia to capture their energy customer.
So let's talk about the European response then. What do you think? Is Europe going to be siding with the U.S. or they will understand which side their bread is buttered and go with Russia?
I was told about 2 weeks ago that a decision was made last year, late last year, by the Germans that they would work closely with China and Russia and build up the trade zone, improve their legal structure, contract structure, and work to create a BRICS gold-backed currency. And, this caused excitement by me and my little gang. We call it the inner circle, but not meant to be arrogant. It's just 6 or 8 of us. So we trust each other. We all contribute. It's like my office colleagues, and we're scattered around the world. One in Los Angeles and 2 of them in San Francisco, and the voice is all over the place. There's a guy in Chicago with Comex experience. We got a number of people, and they're really smart. But we got all excited. Oh, really? So Germany's going to flip, and that motivated my public article a little over a month ago about Germany flipping east. But it's not like Germany is just going to say, all right, we're just going to, start working with Russia and abandon the dollar, and tomorrow's a new day. No, it's extremely complicated. What you've got with Germany is 2 directions. They can stick with the United States. They can have the European Union work closely with the dollar and the euro. They can have all the banks continue with dollar-based trade and dollar-based treasury bonds in the reserve system. They can continue with all that, but the cost is to the economy. The cost of this so-called stimulus, it's not stimulus. It's just incredibly corrosive monetary policy from 0% interest rate and quantitative easing, the bond monetization. It's causing tremendous capital ruin, capital damage. It's eliminating profit margins. It's killing capital, turning them into mothballs. The equipment's just going offline. So Germany can continue to work with the U.S., the dollar regime, with the euro. They can continue working cooperatively with the British pound and suffer economic damage. And that's what we're seeing now. And the sanctions from Russia are just accelerating the economic damage. I don't want to get into the data behind economic damage, but it's pretty obvious that their economies are going to slow and slow a lot. What's the second alternative? Well, that's the move east.
Is that why, Jim, that Germany, sorry to interrupt, but I read that a major German newspaper came out with a big editorial against these sanctions against Russia?
Well, yeah, they're realizing that it's going to harm the economy. The Germans are very defensive of their strong economy. I'll give you one really important example. In the 1980s and 1990s, the United States turned over, essentially handed over a lot of their industry to Asia, Pacific Rim, and then the climax was 1999 to 2003 to China. Germany did not. Germany did not. Germany did not.
Right.
Germany instead told their labor unions, you've got to come down in your wage structure. Let's get a 15% wage concession, and we will retain all the manufacturing plants for BMW, for Audi, Volkswagen, steel industry, whatever, Siemens. We'll retain it. And we won't put you workers out of business. We won't put you on the street like the Americans did.
Right.
The Americans gave up their industry and a tremendous source of legitimate income. Germany did not. So they're very protective of their industry. And now what they're seeing is 3,000 to 5,000 German companies doing business with Russia are wondering what's next. They don't want the lost business. They got huge heavy rail facilities going from Russia to Germany. They got huge LNG facilities from Gazprom to the northern ports of Germany supplying natural gas. They don't want to interrupt this. It's part of their industry. They're very protective of their industry. The United States is full of sabotage to their industry. And as a result, the United States is seeing a systemic failure, And they want to bring about a systemic failure for Europe also. Ukraine is their device. If they cut off the alliance between Europe and Russia, cut off the energy supply from the monopoly of Gazprom, they can cripple the European economy. And I don't think there's great disappointment by the U.S. offices right now, government offices, over damage to the agricultural business in Europe. They want destruction of the economy. The U.S. fascist regime is all about destruction of the economy because it works hand in glove to the totalitarian world. I don't like using WNWO, but the global fascist state. If you get crumbling economies, you've got a totalitarian state coming out of it. That's what the U.S. wants for Europe. And their trade pact, the joke of a trade pact that the U.S. is proposing with Europe, is all about incredibly heavy-handed corporate powers, patent powers, internet powers, all kinds of basic fascist business model strictures where corporations would rule and parliaments would not.
Well, Jim, then in that, let's talk about the U.S. then. What's happening inside the U.S. itself? Then we've talked about the Europe and Russia and the outside world. So let's talk about what's happening here domestically.
Well, we're now in our fourth year of 0%, and we're in our third year of bond monetization. How's that working out, Dash?
Well, according to the mainstream, it's working out great.
Yeah, they got this great stimulus. So Wall Street is happy that they're able to ditch their bonds and have them bought out by printing press money. It's funny, from 1960 to 1985 and 90, guys like Volcker and Burns and Greenspan, they all preached that if you do excessive monetary inflation, you wreck the economy. What's different now? We're wrecking the economy. So what's happening is the United States is going into an accelerated decline. And notice in the first quarter, they talked about a 2.7% GDP decline first quarter. Well, they always lie by 4% or more on the inflation. They call inflation growth. If you lie on what inflation is, you're calling inflation growth. So we've got something like a 6 or 7% recession in the first quarter, and now they're actually it's funny. They're not lying better; they're lying bigger. They're actually trying to tell us that you have a 2 or 3% snapback recovery in the second quarter, but they're measuring inflation as next to nothing when it's actually getting bigger. I think the lie on inflation for the second quarter in the U.S. economy, the lie is going to be about 6 or 7%. So subtract 6% from even 2, and you get a 4% recession. We don't like to talk about the lie in inflation. We like to talk about progress, and it's almost like a law. You talk about the economy, you must talk about the recovery. You must put a different adjective in front of recovery. How about non-existent? That's my favorite. But the U.S. is trying to protect from an implosion that I believe is imminent. Maybe not right away, but unavoidable. It's a better word. Unavoidable because the whole world is starting to go on strike. They've got, it's like a quarantine going on. If the U.S. wants to have its debts covered by the Weimar press at the Fed, the bond monetization, the QE, it's not virtuous. It's destructive. It's highly destructive of foreign nations' Forex savings. So if the United States wants to go ahead and rely on inflation to cover its debt, monetizing its debt, this is what third world countries do. We taught this for 30 years, and now we are the third world country doing it. So the rest of the world is trying to avoid the dollar. They've got 21 or 23 nations now working with China on yuan swap facilities to do bilateral trade settlement, like Australia and China, like Germany and China. They're not using the dollar anymore. And if you get the whole world that's not using the dollar for energy sales, and I'm pointing particularly to number one and number two, the Russians and the Saudis. If the Russians and Saudis both agree and announce no need to use a dollar anymore, the United States will slip into the third world in 6 months, maybe less. This is what the U.S. is trying to prevent. And they're trying to latch on to Europe and England, kind of lashing them together so that Europe and England will go down with the United States instead of being isolated from the United States. I think they're going to lose the battle, and the United States is going to be isolated in an unspeakable way.
Okay, well, since you said unspeakable, I won't ask you to speak to that. But, just to counter that, what you're saying here, I watched this interview from India, and sometimes you get better information coming from those media sources than you do here. And it was the former director of the Asia Development Bank, and he claims that even with this BRICS bank coming and all that, that they're still going to have to keep relying on the dollar at least for the next 20 years or so.
I think the dollar is going to be around for quite a while. And the main point to keep in mind about the dollar is the momentum in the decline in the usage of the dollar, not its disappearance. I think I heard recently that something like 68% of all global trade is done in the dollar. In 3 years, it might be 57 or 52. In 7 years, it might be 45 or 48 or 41. It's not going to go away quickly because it has so many root structures. The whole world is trying desperately to use something besides the dollar because the Americans are covering their debt with a printing press of money, and they're waging war on a credit card, and they're supplying their economy with worthless treasury bonds in return. You can't do those three things. You cannot undermine foreign forex savings. You cannot cover your debt with printing press money. You cannot wage war and have your victims finance your war effort. So the whole world is trying desperately to use something besides the dollar. And, every couple months, you see another nation or two lined up with China with a yuan swap facility. And these are really important things because the yuan swap enables 5 banks from Australia to link up with 3 banks in China, and they all settle their debt without dealing with dollars. But let me get back to a point that I was making about Germany, because I have my notes here. The one alternative is to stick with the United States, stick with the dollar, stick with the euro, and suffer huge economic damage. That's what we're seeing now. The other alternative is to work with supplanting the dollar with a gold-backed currency. Work with Russia and China to conduct far more trade outside the dollar. I'm focusing on Germany here. Work with a whole lot more in say, investment banking of Russian and Chinese firms, issuing stock, issuing bonds in Frankfurt, Germany. Okay, do this in an accelerated fashion and pull the rug out from the banks in the West. If Germany does that second alternative of no longer supporting the dollar, what they will cause is a contagion of bank failures that will result in some derivative events. And I'm not talking about a couple, $100 billion in losses from a group of 8 banks. I'm talking about far more than that, and losses that you're going to have a hard time keeping track of the zeros for. I'm talking about something like 80 to 150 trillion dollars in derivative accident losses. So Germany has 2 choices. Allow their economy with all their prestigious industry to go down the tubes, or to sink the U.S. and London banks. I think they're going to sink the U.S. and London banks, from what I'm told, but they're going to do it very slowly. Watch Deutsche Bank. I was told by The Voice way back in 2011, some serious case is coming against Deutsche Bank for fraud having to do with qualification of the European Monetary Union. I'm talking about Maastricht rules. Your economy has to have no more than a certain amount of debt. So Deutsche Bank helped a number of countries like Italy in particular, I think Spain and France too, but in Italy I'm sure of. What they did was they hid their debt by doing swaps with Forex currencies. So they were debt for currency swaps, and they were off the books. So they qualified for the European Monetary Union. France, Italy, Spain, all qualified for the euro, and everybody lived happily ever after for 10 years until everything fell apart. So I think Germany is going to deploy the slow path in pulling the rug out from U.S. and London banks. And as Deutsche Bank gets into more and more trouble, you're going to see more and more of the devices being pulled away. Notice how shortly after Deutsche Bank was in trouble with legal problems, the LIBOR fix became a scandal. Shortly after that, it's the London gold fix. Deutsche Bank is out. They sold their seat. And the gold fix is in such disarray, they can't even sell the seat that Deutsche Bank got rid of. So next is the Forex problems. So we've got gold market, LIBOR market, which is interest rate, gold market, LIBOR market, and Forex market currencies, all three coming under fire as a result of Deutsche Bank getting prosecuted by Interpol and their serious fraud division. This is something that I call in the domain of the new sheriff in town. It's not the London bankers in charge anymore. It's not the Wall Street bankers in charge anymore. It's not the Vatican black nobility in charge anymore. There's a higher power, and it's extremely difficult to get information about it. But one of their projects since March of 2012 was to pull out of London 1,000 tons of gold per month. And it hasn't stopped. We're talking about 28,000 tons of gold removed from London in the last 2+ years. Who is this higher power? Who is the new sheriff in town? I think it has to do, I don't want to give names, but I think it has to do with ancient Asian families that are sick of what's going on in the world and the evil that's taken root in Western governments from fascist root systems.
Good enough, Jim. Good enough. As usual, you have given us much information to chew on and to research, and you have really dug deep down as you usually do. So it's been very, very informative. I know you have some pressing engagements that you have to attend to, so I will not keep you any longer, although I guess we could keep talking like this for hours and hours, but we'll save that for another time. So could you please just give us a little, before you go, just a little summary of the salient points of what you're saying, and also your contact information with your website, etc.?
The big battle to watch right now is the establishment of RMB hub facilities. There's a competition going on between London and Frankfurt, Germany. I'm told that Germany is going to win this because they're going to be able to offer a lot more investment capital for new companies, Russian companies, Chinese companies. The Russians and Chinese don't trust the British. So the British are going to walk a fine line as they try to establish their RMB hub facility. RMB stands for renminbi, which is basically Chinese for people's money, aka synonymous, totally synonymous with Chinese yuan. So these RMB hub facilities that are springing up, they are going to be very important to Russia as well. They have two main functions: to sell in Chinese currency bonds. Like McDonald's, they sell Chinese yuan-based bonds. They sell them. And there's a nickname for them. They call the dim sum bonds. But Germany has some bonds that are denominated in Chinese currency also. They're calling them the Goethe bonds, after the poet, Goethe. It's Goethe. Americans might call him Goethe. No, but it's Goethe. So the Goethe bonds and the dim sum bonds are going to be, I think, very prominent. The second function, in addition to bond sales for RMB hubs, is conversion of Chinese yuan into other currencies, like the minor currencies, like the Thai baht, even the Australian dollar, the Colombian peso, Brazilian real. These are not major currencies, but they need to have conversion. And the Chinese are working vigorously to create these RMB hubs, to expand the Shanghai trade zone, free trade zone, and to really get going in accelerated mode with making the Chinese currency a good, viable alternative for the dollar. I don't think they're going to supplant the dollar. I think what they're going to do is they're going to see a rise in the RMB usage for trade, a rise in the bond issuance for financial trade. And slowly, the dollar will be used less. The dollar's going to die from 10,000 cuts. That's a comment from London Paul, one of my new buddies and sources from the London financial sector. Smart guy. It's not going to die from 6, tragic wounds to the heart. It's going to be 10,000 cuts. And that's what's coming for the dollar. It's going to be ignored, and eventually it's going to be quarantined, because the Fed is not going to taper. The Fed is going to amplify because the dollar is in deep trouble. The U.S. economy is accelerating in its decline. The government deficits are a grand lie. They're not coming down to 400 and 500 billion a year for the U.S. government. No, there's a revision. Oh, oops. Looks like last year actually was $1 trillion in losses and deficits. No, they lie each month and then correct when the year's over. This is so. All right, I've got a newsletter. It's called the Hat Trick Letter. It's been in existence since May of 2004. So I had a 10-year anniversary a few months ago, and I was very excited about that. And a lot of the competitors are basically gone because they couldn't survive their wrong forecasts. They didn't have really good sources. They didn't have really good analysis, and they relied too much on mining stocks, which I do not. I always tell people, buy gold and silver coins and bars and make it 80% silver, because you're going to see double and triple the gains in the silver price compared to gold. Gold's going to go up a lot, to be sure. Silver's going to go way, way up. So on goldenjackass.com website, you see a lot of free information, public articles, interviews like this. And some people rely on that for a while, and then they say, okay, I'm getting up to speed in certain things. My eyes are getting opened. I'm learning a number of different things, and I want more, and they sign up for the newsletter. And one of the biggest compliments I get, there are two big compliments I get. One is people come back. They've been a subscriber, say, 2008, 9, 10, and 11, and then they backed out. And then they come back. Well, that's a big thrill for me. And the other thrill that I hear from clients is, well, I was following your stuff for 2 or 3 years, and then I'm just amazed at how much more and deeper stuff, really intriguing stuff, is in your newsletter. So beyond what's in the free material from public articles and interviews, there's a lot that's in there in the 2 reports each month. Every month has 2 reports: the Money War report, high-level things, and the Golden Currency report for ground-level things. So take a look at the website, bounce around a bit, and sign up.
Yes, I will second that, guys. Anybody listening, please do sign up, because the information is truly, well, it's gargantuan in detail, and it's much more in-depth than anything that I ever come across. So, Jim, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this, taking the time. I know you're a busy man, so I appreciate you coming on and talking to my audience. And I'm sure this fall is shaping up to be a very interesting one. We've had a pretty cool summer up here in the Northeast. And I think the cooling of the economy as well is probably going to be more visible come the fall and winter than it has been. The masking of it will no longer be possible, I think. And therefore, I'll have to have you back on in the very near future as these things shape up in front of our eyes.
I think you're going to see Europe suffering from the Russian energy card in a few months.
Yes, I would agree with you. I would totally agree with you on that one, and that could be very, very big news in its implications, so we'll keep our eye out for that.
Okay, well, a pleasure being on with you, Dash, and it's been fun. Always stimulating.
Same here, Jim. Take care, and let's talk again soon.
Okay.
Through the countryside they would sing her beauty fair, but as yet her life was a thing of sin and care. When the Lord came walking her way and told her, now stay, you still may be saved. It is not too late, Mary Magdalene. From her eyes the tears of the grief came falling fast. But the Lord brought words of relief and joy at last. Fear no more, you shall be forgiven. There's mercy in heaven for you as love. It is not too late, Mary Magdalene. Now her newfound Lord she was serving lovingly, followed with devotion unswerving patiently. To the cross as she was inclined, the very last time when Jesus had smiled. It is not too late.